how many days did it take for creation to happen? 6. And what did he do on the 7th? Rested on the 7th, okay? We talked about the timing of that. How long ago was that, according to what the Bible seems to indicate? About 6,000 years. How do we get that time? Anybody remember? By reading in the Bible, of course. We get it out of Genesis chapter number 5 and Genesis chapter number 9, where you see those two different genealogies that are given, those chronogenealogies that are given. Or Genesis 10, 5 and 10, I believe is where they are, where you get that 2 list. And that comes up to about, from Genesis 1, where God created Adam and Eve and all of that, to the flood, it's about 1,656 years. When you get to from the flood to Noah's time, the flood to Abraham's time, it's about 400 years, something along those lines. So it comes close to about a 2,000-year frame right there. So you got 2,000 years, put those two together. Then you got from Abraham to Jesus, how much time does that take? Abraham to Jesus, give me a guess. Come on. 1,600. A little more. It's a good square number. 2,000. It's about a 2,000-year time frame. Okay. Then from Jesus to our time, what are we at? 2020. 2020. Okay. So what are we at now? 6,000. We're a little over 6,000, probably about the time frame of how long it takes for creation. All right. What's the second C that we come to? Corruption. What's corruption have to deal with? Sin entering into that very good world. And when sin came into the world, what did it do to the rest of the world? What's the C say? It corrupted it, right? It corrupted that world, and everything was affected by it. You know, we see both good and bad in this world, and we see beauty, and at the same time we see death at the same time. And it's hard you really can't separate those two. And in fact, we've lived in this corrupted world for all our life, and for so many years, humanity has a hard time even imagining what that would look like, to not be in a world without that, or to be in a world that doesn't have that. Let me say it right. So that's the second C. Third C. Say it. Catastrophe. What's the catastrophe? Noah's flood. And Noah's flood explains what we see in the world today. The world was majorly, drastically changed because of Noah's flood. You had a whole bunch of people, and then it got reduced down to how many people? 8. Good. And then after the flood was over, how long did the flood last? Don't give me the 40 days. That's not the right answer. 140 days? About a year. A year and about 10 days. That's how long the flood lasted. It only rained 40 days and 40 nights. Flood lasted a lot longer. It doesn't immediately dry up the next day after the 40th day, right? Took a while for all that to go away. So when they get off, what happens at that point?
Sacrifice.
We saw the sacrifice. What did we talk about last week that the flood must have affected, or maybe even created, set the right atmosphere for? The Ice Age. Okay? We don't necessarily talk about the Ice Age being in the Bible, but if you think about it, the Bible doesn't really live in the very range where the ice was at all. I mean, anytime you see anybody writing in the Scriptures, they weren't in that period or in that location where the ice would be in the north or the south. They're more in the center, hot parts of the world. So, does anybody know where the most ice is talked about in the Bible? We didn't talk about this last week. Anybody know where it's mostly talked about? In the Bible. In the book of Job speaks about it the most. And the book of Job would have been right where that was happening, at that time frame when that was happening. Though he doesn't talk about living in it and going through it and all that, but God actually asks the question about where does the snow come from, where does the ice come from. He's the one that obviously is the creator of that. Okay, so now we come to the fourth of the 7 C's. This one is called confusion. Anybody got an idea why it's called confusion? Because Tower of Babel. What happens at the Tower of Babel? They get all confused. They get all confused. Okay, so we're going to spend some time looking at this. We're going to look at it for a couple weeks, at least, the Tower of Babel, and I think you'll enjoy it as we get through there. And it's during this, what we talked about the Ice Age last week, that this event would have somewhere started to be in that. Okay, even though we're not seeing that really happening, this event would have happened in that time frame. Turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 10. Now, while you're turning it there, I want to ask you a question to kind of prompt a thought for a moment. We've been looking at this kind of chronologically for the time. Were the pyramids built in Egypt at the time of the Tower of Babel? Ask that question. Were the pyramids built in Egypt at the time of the Tower of Babel? Who says no? Raise your hand. Who says yes? Who says I don't know? Who says, I think you're going to ask a trick question? I'm not asking a trick question. We're going to talk about that and look at that a little more specifically. We're going to start reading in Genesis chapter 10, right at the very last verse, verse number 32, all the way to 11:9. And we're going to look at some events that happened here that plays out and really is formative, shapes society to this day because of what happened in this little portion of Scripture here. So, if I get some readers, let's see. Let's get someone new that hasn't read in the last couple weeks.
I need to know where you're at.
Genesis 10:32. 10:32 to 11:9. You read last week, so hold on, okay? Darla, why don't you read 10:32 to 11:5? Can you do that? And then I need 11:6 to 11:9. Can you do that? Okay, Fred's got that.
These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. And the whole earth was one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded.
Okay, Fred?
Okay. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do it. Now will nothing be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off the build of the city.
Verse 9.
Okay, therefore is the name of this called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from this did the Lord scatter them abroad on the face of all the earth.
Okay, now, I didn't tell you this, but if you went to chapter 10 and you looked at chapter 10, and it gives a whole list of nations. It divides the three sons of Noah up into three sets of families that you have. You have this chapter 10 is called the Table of Nations. It's where you get to see the nations split out. And it actually talks about them being and speaking different languages, spreading out all over the earth. But then you get to chapter 11, and it says they're all of one tongue, all of one speech, and they're all together. Is there a contradiction?
No.
What's going on?
Those people, those children.
It's just confused? Is that what you said? Okay, so here's how it goes. Anybody remember go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, and it gives us the 6 days of creation. Then we jump into Genesis 2, and what does it do at Genesis 2? Actually, when you get into Genesis 2, it ends with the 7th day. But then it jumps into Genesis 2, it goes back to the 6th day and talks about what happened on the 6th day, when man was made, and then the woman was made, and the animals were named, and the marriage happened. All of that happened on the 6th day that we see playing out, but God kind of gave a big outline for us and then gives us an intimate detail in the 6th day. That's sort of what's happening here with Genesis 10 and then jumping over to Genesis 11. You got an outline of the nations splitting apart, and boy, that's quite an interesting study in and of itself. If you get to take the time to ever do that, to go and look at where these names actually can find their locations in the world today, where they split out. They came out of those three sons of Noah, right? Now we get to Genesis chapter number 11, and it actually explains why they split. What happened to make them spread out all over the earth. What were they told to do? They were told to spread out. They were told to spread out. Did they do that? No, they didn't do it at all. Now, in the text here, how many languages does it say were spoken? One. Yeah, did you notice here it doesn't just say language, it says and of one speech. It says the earth was of one language and of one speech. Is it kind of being redundant, or is there something more being said there? Yeah, when I was doing the study when we were going through the Genesis 1 through 11, one of the things I remember finding out at that when he says one language, one speech, it's not saying they spoke the same language twice in the same little verse. It's actually saying they spoke the same language and they had the same dialect all at the same time. If you ever go to another part of the United States, maybe go up into Boston, do they have a different dialect than you? You go down to where I'm from. Do they have a different dialect? If you've been down to the South, you know they talk a little different. Y'all is used quite often. It took me a few years to break that one out of my vocabulary. It's you all here, right? You go up into Canada, in certain parts where they speak English, they got some extra words they use and extra things they say. Go over to Australia, they talk English, but it's different. You go to Ireland, some of that don't even sound like English. Some of the stuff they say. Is it a different dialect, isn't it? What's he saying here about the nation, about these people at this point? They were all of the same language, all of the same dialect. They all kind of came from the same place, all had the same way they talked. They had the same slangs, they had the same words. They all used the same. Where does it say they came from? Verse 2. They came from the east. They came from the east. Where does it say that they settled? In a plain in the land of Shinar. In the land of Shinar. Would that be a good place to stay? Anybody know what Shinar is believed to mean? The word Shinar, actually, they think what it means. Anybody got the definition, heard the definition before? Land between two rivers. Land between two rivers. And they actually think they know where that's at because there are two rivers in that area that kind of flow kind of parallel with each other. Anybody know what those two rivers are? One's a very famous one, Euphrates, and then the other one, Tigris. The Tigris and the Euphrates. And anybody know where they think that possibly is at today? Where that country is? It's Iraq is where they believe it's actually at. Where they think this probably is. And it was probably very fertile, very good land to be in. Then it says here that when they got there, what did they intend to build? Two things it says that they said they wanted to build. A city and a tower. How was the tower described? One to reach the heavens. Now I want you to notice here, we're looking at, hopefully you got a King James Bible, you'll notice something they did in that. Look at verse number 4, and they said, let us build us a city and a tower whose top, look at the next two words, may reach, do you see they're italicized? That means they weren't there. They were added in when they were translated, when this book was translated, unto heaven. It says, whose top unto heaven. If you were to take those two words out and they put may reach, does that mean when they're talking about may reach unto heaven that they're necessarily, it's being added in, does it mean that they meant to build one that could touch the clouds? That's probably not the intent at all. Most likely it was a tower unto the heavens, meaning that it was a tower to worship the heavens. You say, why do you say that? Because when you look back in history and you see that these towers, and I'm going to show you here in just a minute, many of them were built with that intention, with that purpose, where they worshiped the moon, they worshiped the sun, they worshiped the stars, even putting them in certain locations where they actually faced a certain direction or were perfectly lined up with certain things that happened in the heavens and so forth, is obviously they built it for the worship of the heavens, okay? And so what we probably have here is the very first time we see man since the flood, beginning to turn against God again. This is the very first actual description of false religion starting up right here. It's quite interesting that you'll see, if you read through the rest of your Bible, that you'll see that it's believed that most of the false religions come out of this one place. Out of this one place. Why would that be? Because that's where all of us were at one point, right? And they just kind of spread that out. They call it the Babel religions, the mystery religions that come out of this place. Okay? Now, what's the purpose of building this city and this tower? They kind of have a couple purposes that they make, that they say they want to do this for. Make them a name for themselves. What's the other? And not be scattered on the earth. Two things they want. They want to bring glory to themselves, make a name for themselves, and second, they don't want to be scattered. It's an attitude of saying we want to be the one in charge, we want to be the one that gets the glory, and we don't want to do what we're being told to do. God told, anybody remember what God told Noah to do with his sons? He says, be fruitful, be multiply, and do what? And fill the earth. And the implication of that is you're not to stay in one location. Why are you not to stay in one location? God said it, because men's hearts are still evil from their youth. What happens when men get together and hold together? They decide to do evil together, don't they? And evil minds working with evil minds make more evil, right? And that's the idea of what he's saying here. He wants them to spread out. The very idea of the development of nations is meant to hold back evil. Think about it in our day and time. Why do we have multiple nations in the world? Outside of thinking about Babel and what happens at Babel, what would it do to stem the tide of evil in this world? Well, if man can't join hands with man, guess what happens? Evil's held back. Go back to World War II, when Adolf Hitler did what he did, going in and taking over nations and all of that kind of stuff, and people stood up to him and stopped him. What were we doing? Holding back evil. Did we realize that we were doing something that God even works through? We may not have realized that, but has God worked through war to stop evil? Go back all the way to Israel, going in and conquering the land of Canaan. Why did they go in and conquer the land of Canaan? To stop evil. Right? To hold back evil. And then God said, if you don't hold back your own evil in your own land, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to send another nation in, and that other nation is going to take you out of your land. Remember that? It's this kind of check that's continually going on, and God intended that to happen with the nations. That the nations would hold each other in check, hold back evil. Okay? So what does God do when He sees them building this city and this tower? He gets ticked off. Now, I like Bill. He gets ticked off and goes and confuses their language. Is that right? Does he get mad? He does get mad. Is it wrong to build a city? No, there's nothing wrong with building a city. We need to get that point understood. There are people that are going to go and build cities after this. He's not going to go and confuse them again. He's not going to go after them again. The intention that he's going after is obviously the heart, right? He's dealing with the motive of their heart and what they're doing and all of this stuff. It was their motive behind building the city. Up to this point, they are clearly demonstrating that they don't want to do what God said. That they want to continue to do evil. In fact, one of the things he said, God said, if I don't do anything, he says, then nothing will be withheld from them. It's sort of a way of saying, you don't put this in check now, they'll go to the end. I mean, they'll continue to go as far as they can go to the evil and to pursue evil. So that's what God is dealing with, okay? He's saying, I realize that we've got to put a stop to this. We've got to put a check to this. And remember, what is He not going to do? What did He say He will never do again? He's not going to flood the earth. So we know that's not how He's going to respond this time. Well, you'd have to have another guy build a boat again. Yeah. So that's not what He's going to do. But He didn't say He's not going to do what He's going to do here, change the languages. Okay? So He goes down and He confuses the language. And what happens as a result? When you got them being confused? They stop building, they scatter, and go to Genesis chapter 10 if you want to go back and look, and you'll see how they scattered. You'll see how they spread. By the way, did you notice that it said that, if you notice in Genesis chapter number 10, it gives you about 70 different families listed. It's about 70. There's kind of guess on whether some are actually considered some families or not, or how many might be within a group that's called a family. You got about 70 families or so that are scattered. I want you to get this idea here. It's not that, let's say Bill and Kathy are there at the Tower of Babel, and Bill's there building and putting stuff together, and all of a sudden the language thing changes, and he comes home and finds Kathy speaking a different language than he speaks. That wouldn't have happened. Because what it indicates, what God did is He changed families of languages. He had families have different languages. So you would have had all the Brinks would have gone off into one language. All the Browns would have gone off to another language. All the Dolls would have gone off to another place. You get the idea? He's not splitting families apart. He's not splitting individuals in the families apart. He's keeping the families together, but He's splitting the nation apart to make multiple nations. Nations, if you'll remember back, or go all the way up to chapter number 12, where God told Abraham that in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And we understand that to mean nations, but you really understand these families from that perspective. These are those families that come out of Noah's 3 sons. Is there a possibility that the Tower of Babel was possibly an ancient ziggurat? Anybody ever heard of a ziggurat before? You should know about it if you were here last year for Vacation Bible School. We had to build one. Built a couple, didn't we? A ziggurat. It's possible that that's what it could have been. And the reason why, instead of it being like a spiraling tower that would have gone up and all of this kind of thing real high, it would have been more like a staircase, a stepping staircase that goes up higher and higher and higher. And at the top, they would have used it to worship. And that's oftentimes what they did. The temple grounds at the highest part of that temple or of that tower would have been the place where they offered sacrifices. And that kind of attitude never really leaves the people. If you go back and you look through the people of Israel, when they came into the land of Canaan, what did they do when they turned away from God? Where did they go to worship at? On top of hills and high places. That there's just kind of this attitude that if I get up higher, that I'm going to somehow get closer to the God I'm worshiping. And I don't know if that's just the attitude of heart that they've got, but that seems to be what's going on here. Then third thought to think on here for a moment. The root issue going on here is that people have arrogantly attempted to make a name for themselves and claim autonomy. Anybody know what autonomy is? Huh? Independence. To claim to be the one that can call all the shots. Does God want us to do that? God didn't create man to just kind of do it how He wants to do it. God is still their God, regardless of whether they want Him to be or not. And He expects them to honor Him as their God. And that's a big part of that. How many times do we do that? Where we decide to go do something for ourselves, for our purpose, for our glory, and then sort of expect God to kind of bless that.
Every day.
We shouldn't, should we? We should live our lives. It doesn't mean that we don't take care of our needs or work to pay our bills and all that kind of stuff, but we should live our lives not for making a name for ourselves, but for honoring His name, right? That should be the way we live, okay? And then maybe the fourth thought here, in typical fashion, even God's curse is used to glorify Himself. And we see that as we continue on into chapter 12, where God begins to, because He has split the nations apart, now He can work with one particular family. And what family is that going to be? Abraham's family. And again, just get this now. You go into the New Testament, when the Lord Jesus Christ comes, He says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, bond or free. They are all one. And there's that attitude that they are all being joined back together. All being joined back together. God doesn't want them to be joined with corrupt hearts. What does He want them to be joined with? Hearts that have been changed by who? by Christ himself, right? By the Messiah. So the splitting out so he can call them back together. Splitting out so he can work through one family line and ultimately bring them all back together. That's the attitude of heart that God's got. That's the direction that's going on here. So even though he judges, he still gets glory. Now the people, they seem to be avoiding spreading across the earth. Why do you think they might have said, I don't want to leave? Friends and relatives? Not too many adventurers? Right, have a real nice farm right there. Don't want to leave. It's the attitude is not necessarily that it was wrong to stay in the sense of that this location is wrong. The attitude is what was going on in the heart. That they wanted to stay for themselves. They wanted to stay for their glory. They wanted to stay to continue to pursue that which was wrong for them to do. Okay? So you kind of get that idea. Now, anybody got an idea how long it happened after the flood? When did this happen? 50 to, did you say 100 years? 50 to 100 years? You think the Bible has any timing indicators of when it actually happened? Well, there's at least one. We know they multiplied. So we've had multiple people. And if you get into Genesis chapter 10, it tells you at least you got 70 families that have come out of those three. That seems to probably, possibly, somewhere in those 70 families, somewhere that it's probably about that time frame, how long it would have taken to do that. Well, then you go into Genesis 11, and it tells us another little indicator after the Tower of Babel. I want you to look at verse number 17. And this is one of those chronogenealogies like you got in Genesis 5, where you got from Shem all the way to Abraham. And then it mentions in verse 17, and Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu, and Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters, and so forth. You see a list of the names of Peleg, but if you were to go back and look in Genesis 10 and focus on Peleg for a moment, it mentions that in his time, the earth would be divided. In his time frame. You say, well, then when was that? We'll go all the way from that Shem all the way to Peleg, and you'll find out. Some people have estimated it's about 115 years. Something along that line. So from the time of the flood of Noah to the time of Peleg, which is probably the time in which the earth split apart, and we're not talking about continents split apart, we're talking about a family of people split apart, was in that day, was in that time. So we're looking at just how short a time it was from the flood to another rebellion to once again another judgment. God, this just shows you how wicked people are, right? I mean, it doesn't take very long for people to turn their hearts against God and forget that He's a God who can do horrible things when He judges. I mean, wasn't the flood enough to scare you to think, I'll never do this again? But they didn't take the warning to heart, did they? Didn't take the warning to heart. And you get some indicators also, if you were to look back at Genesis chapter 10, there's a guy named Nimrod, whom the Bible calls a mighty hunter before the Lord, and it talks about him having multiple kingdoms, and one of his kingdoms, anybody know what the kingdom's name is? Starts with a B. It's what we're talking about. Babel. It's very possible that he was also leading this. And so the people joined hands with this guy. And the fact it mentions him 2 or 3 times being mighty before the Lord, or a mighty hunter before the Lord. Anybody got an idea why he would be called that? Does that mean he was like he loved God and served God and was faithful to God and he had a mighty testimony before God? You think he killed big animals? You think he's one of the ones that killed all the tyrannosaurs off? Well, they weren't Christians at that time by name. Do you think he might have been a hunter of people that don't want to follow? I want you to think about the timeline here. We're looking at 100 so years after. Who's still alive? Noah's still alive. Who else is still alive? Shem, Ham, Japheth are still alive. You go and add up their ages, they're still there. Why aren't they doing anything to stop this? Are they complicit to it? Or are they being forced to do it by their own family, forcing them to do this? I mean, you just got to think. I don't really know the details behind it. We are not told the details behind it. It kind of leaves us to guess. But it does seem to tell us that it's possible that they had some major influence from one of their mighty ancestors that came out of them, that had great pull, had great power, and was able to make people do what they didn't want to do necessarily. So that's possible as well, okay? So we got that happening. All right, now let's go to Genesis 10:24. Actually, this is what I already had, I just told you about. We can go ahead and look at it. Look at those verses real quick. Genesis 10:24, this is where we see the Peleg part where they split apart. Who wants to read verse 24 and 25? TJ do 1 and Paul do 25. You do 24, you do 25, Paul. Little Paul. Go ahead. Eber.
And two Ebers were born 2 times. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan.
Now the name Peleg there actually means divided. It's almost interesting. It's similar to what you see happening in Genesis 5 where you have names being given. Methuselah is being given a name. And the name means the one of the sending forth. And it gives the idea that when he dies, judgment's going to be sent forth. It was sort of prophetic. In this case, it appears to be that as well, that he was given that name Peleg because in his days, division would happen. The nations would be divided, or the family would be, that one gigantic family of Noah would be split apart. And it must have been that God's obviously working behind the scenes here and working in the midst of this, and there's still things going on. Do you think there are people that still love God in the midst of this? Yeah. That were true followers of God? Yeah, there must have been some. Did you notice there's a couple names in there that we still use to this day in that little verse, those verses we just read? You may not realize it, but we use them still quite often. Peter? I didn't see Peter in there. Huh? Barak? Begat. No, names. Okay, let me show them to you here. Look at verse 25. Eber and Shem. Okay, what do you get out of there? I guess I don't have Shem in here, but we did look at Shem. Where do we get Shem? What word do we use out of Shem today? We get Semite, or you hear that word said a lot in politics, anti-Semitic. It comes out of the name Shem. Eber, what's that? The word Hebrew comes out of that word. The people of the Ebers, or the Eberites, are the ones that are later called Hebrews. Anybody know who the very first Eber that we really know about is? That he's most famous? Abraham, the very first really known to be called a Hebrew when you get into Genesis a little bit further, especially when he gets into the land of Canaan. He is the one that's called a Hebrew, comes out of that name. Okay? All right, so that's where we are at. Let me give you a few handouts. I'm just going to have you hopefully share a little bit here. TJ, if you'll pass them out among the families. Just one per family. I didn't get a bunch of them here. But I want you to see those pictures here for a moment. The first picture that you're seeing, look on the front of there, is obviously an artist's representation of the Tower of Babel, possibly what it may have looked like. And again, we're not certain where it was located. We know it was in the plains of Shinar. We don't even know for sure what it actually looked like. I have a book that someone just gave me. When I was living in Omaha, my next door neighbor was doing a garage sale, and he had a bunch of stuff he just couldn't even sell, and he ended up getting rid of it. And he said, "You want any books here?" And he gave me a book, and it was just a big book of ancient stories and things, and architecture and locations and pictures of stuff. And one of the pictures that they had in there, I opened it up. One of the pictures that they had in that was a picture of this one gigantic square ground. Obviously, it was a satellite picture. And they put in there, you could see the foundation of it and all. They put in there, this is what they believed was the original Tower of Babel location. And they said that history, they were going through it, and they said history goes down and says that thing got tore down and rebuilt and tore down and rebuilt multiple times throughout its history. But they believe that was the very first one of those kinds. But if you turn your page and look at the other ones, you notice that you got a bunch that look like this all over the world. A bunch of these things that look like this all over the world. You got some that are in Iraq. You got some that are in China. You got some that are in Central America. You got some that are in South America. You even have some that are in North America. Some of these kinds of same type of structures built. And very similar in religion. Very similar in practice. We know the most famous pyramids. What do we think about when we're talking about? It's one of your pictures that you have there. The Egyptian pyramid. You wonder where that came from, that whole idea, that whole concept came from. Very possible that it came all the way from, not Egypt, came all the way from where? The very first tower that was built. Okay? You got some even in England. They've discovered places where it looks like they built towers in England. It's a big dome, it's a big mud hill that's kind of shaped like that there in England, all over the place. Yes?
We have one on top of our church.
No, that's a little different. Little different. Why would they be similar? Why would you have similarity all over the world like this?
And at that time, that's probably the most like structural thing.
Well, I mean, why would you have, let's just take it for a moment. Why would you have it all the way in China, Africa, Europe, Central America, North America, South America, and have all these structures that are similar and they're so far removed from each other? What would be the reason why they'd look all similar? Because they all came from one place. They all came from the very first place. Think about it this way. If you had suddenly was forced to leave, do you think you would immediately develop a new culture, a new religion, a new system of government, all of that? No. What would you reproduce? What you were. You would produce what you came out of. And that's what you could expect. Would they change over time? Yeah. Especially as they begin to develop their cultures and they begin to develop practices that other places obviously are no longer practicing. That's why when you go to some of these towers, there are towers that are dedicated to other types of gods as opposed to what you would find in other parts of the world. Some of them end up becoming for another reason entirely. I don't think that they were standing on top of the pyramids in Egypt and offering sacrifices. One, I don't know that you could even stand up on top of them. But they made them as a means as to house the pharaohs and all of that kind of stuff. So it changed its meaning and it changed its purpose. But it obviously had some kind of a historical background. Even Abraham, when he comes out, you know where he comes from? He comes from Ur of the Chaldees. You know when they uncovered the Ur of the Chaldees, you know what they found in Ur of the Chaldees? It's still there today. A huge, huge tower that was dedicated to worshiping the goddess Nanar, who was the moon goddess. And he came out of that culture. He came out of that lifestyle, came out of that worship. Now, here's the question. Archaeologists, historians, they say that the pyramids in Egypt were built 2600 BC. They say some of the pyramids that are built in Peru, in Central America, South America, were built 3000 BC. According to Bible chronology, Babel would be at best about 2100 BC. What's wrong with those dates that I just gave you? Why would they be off? Why is 2600 BC for the pyramids in Egypt wrong? Because what was the very start of civilization? Babel. And if the Bible says it gives a timeline somewhere after the flood, and we know the flood is 1656 years after creation, and we get another bit about maybe 100 years after that, or maybe a little bit more after that, we're not really that far away from that time from the flood. Then you get into this, so at the best you're about 2100 BC at the best. I mean, that's when you're really giving a lot of extra years in there just in case you might be missing some dates somewhere. But then you say But the pyramids in Egypt were built 2600, and the pyramids in Central America were built 3000 BC. What would be happening in 2600? Well, the flood would end up eventually erasing those, right? And what else would be erased? Yeah, you wouldn't have people over there, right? So we got to realize the chronologies are wrong. Why do they get chronologies wrong? Because they don't have dates on them. They're just guessing, right? Yeah, I mean, they get things wrong all the time, don't they? Let me give you an example of things that are wrong. This is what we experience. We go up to the Mammoth Caves every once in a while up in South Dakota, Hot Springs, South Dakota. We've gone up there several times just to go. It's kind of a fun place to go. You have to put the filters on because they're going to give you their evolutionary timelines and long dates and long ages. And we were there last summer, and they suddenly changed the dates. I mean, they added nearly 100,000 years on top of what it used to be. And I'm like, how did they get that? And they didn't even happen to say they changed the dates. But I know because I went back before and I looked at older videos and older pictures and the dates were different. You know what they demonstrate? They don't know. And the reason why they add the dates is because they try to fit in more time to make things make sense to them in their evolutionary mindset. When they realize something else comes up that contradicts, they have to add more time to it. That's the magic solution to fix the problem. That's what they have to do. So whenever we go to that, we got to realize the Bible is the standard that we need to follow, and remember that historians get it wrong. They get it wrong all the time. We were doing an archaeology study in school at the beginning of the school year, this last, before the year comes to an end here. Our very first part of science was archaeology, and we were talking about how they dated. One of the very first things they were talking about is how they date the civilizations that they find, like in Israel and in other parts of Africa and so forth. They base it on one set of calendars. They base it on the set of the Egyptian calendars. And they don't go to Egyptian calendars and look at Egyptian calendars. They actually base it on what some ancient historian said about Egyptian calendars. And then they base it on his guy and another guy and what they said, and they contradict each other. But they say, but these guys are more closer to the... And we're talking about people that were back in the time of the Greeks. We're talking about a few thousand years removed from Egypt. And they're in the time of the Greeks that they said, oh, this had to happen at this time and this had to happen. And so we go back and say, that's what had to happen. And so everything's based on that timeline. The problem is you got big gaps of time that end up accounting for how do we make all these things fit where they fit. And you can't. So the big deal is you got to remember that they get it wrong. And the only thing in which you can make sure you got it right is the book. Why? Because the one who wrote it was there. The one who's the author of it knows how long it took. Knows all the dates and all the details. So what time did the pyramids of Egypt come? Sometime after what? Babel. Yeah. When did the Incan pyramids come? Sometime after Babel. Okay? That's important to remember. Okay. Last time, and we're going to kind of come to a conclusion here in just a moment. Last time when we were talking about the flood, we talked about memory. Talked about specifically cultures having memory of the flood. You remember we talked about the flood legends. There's somewhere around 300 plus flood legends. Do you think it's possible they might have, since they all come out of the same story as well, that they might also have Tower of Babel legends? You think it's possible they might? Let me read you 3 of them. I'm going to give you 3 of them, and there's lots more. I remember when we went through this before, I looked up probably about a dozen of them that are found, and it wasn't on some creationist website that's making it to fit what they want. It was just stories that they have found in the cultures. This is Guatemala. They called them the Kitches of Guatemala, told of a time when the tribes multiplied and left their old home to go to a place called Tulan. Here the language changed and the people sought new homes in various parts of the world as a result of not being able to understand each other. India. The Meeker tribe in northeastern India tells of the descendants of Ram, who were strong men and were growing dissatisfied with the earth and aspired to conquer heaven. So they began to build a tower. Higher and higher rose the building, till at last the gods and demons feared lest these giants should become the masters of heaven as they already were of earth. So they confounded their speech and scattered them to the four corners of the world. Hence arose all the various tongues of mankind. Polynesia. The Polynesians on the island of Heo say that Rata and his 3 sons survived a great flood. Then they made an attempt to erect a building by which they could reach the sky and see the Creator God, Vatia. But the God in anger chased the builders away, broke down the building, and changed their language so that they spoke diverse tongues. That's just 3 of probably about a dozen or more that I've seen of stories that are found about the Tower of Babel in other cultures. You would expect there to be that if they all came out of that one nation. You would expect that to be. Now again, just like we saw with the Tower of Babel or with the flood, are they all going to be identical in story? Are they all going to have the same names and same gods and same whatever? No, because the cultures developed their own distinctiveness. And they told those stories based on now their culture's distinction. Okay? So that's important to remember. But the fact that you got commonality among these nations shows you they must all come from the same place. I think that's interesting. You can find that in multiple things. I think about dragons. How come every culture in the world's got the same kind of pictures of animals if these things are somehow mythological? Yeah, and you got, they got the same descriptions, they got the same look, they got the same fierceness. And all these ancient, China's got them, Central America's got stories of them. You've got, even in Europe, the guy whose name was, what was his name that killed the dragon? I forget his name. I'll remember it afterwards. The St. George killing the dragon. That was in England. You got in Africa, you got stories of dragons. You've got dragon carvings on temples and all this kind of stuff. But they're all so far removed, and this is nothing but mythology. But somehow you find them all over the world. How does that happen? Except that it's probably because they all at one point existed at time. So just saying, it's interesting that we see that kind of stuff that's going on. Now, one thing to think about, and we're going to be done here, and we might talk about this a little bit more maybe next week, I don't know, but why do people look so different if they all come out of the same family? You got people with dark skin, you got people with light skin, you got people with dark color hair, you got people with light color hair, you got people with red hair. How does that happen? Climate? DNA? Okay, let me ask you a question. If you hang out in the sun very long and you get dark, does that mean that your kids will be dark because you hung out in the sun? No, because your kids don't inherit the climate. They inherit your DNA. So how does it happen then? How does it happen? Well, if you had them all collectively together, they're all going to keep reproducing what's in that collection, right? But if they all of a sudden disperse and split, they're going to produce what they got. The gene pool splits apart. If you have some groups that go off into one, and a certain trait's going to be developed because it's out of that common gene pool that you're no longer getting from all these others anymore. And you go into another part of the world and you get a certain trait that's going to be reproduced, and it's going to be reproduced in mass, and it just keeps happening all over. So when you go into, let's say, Asia, you get kind of a brownish, even to pale white sometimes, color skin. You get the shape of the eye that's common in those parts of the world. You go into Africa, you get the darker skin, darker hair that happens. You go into Europe, what do you get? You get the light, you get Darlis coat. Right? We all come out of those different things, but it's not that one's greater or one's less in humanity. It's not that people that have a darker skin are lower in the chain of evolution. It's because genetics. We don't have any problem with understanding that your little puppy dog probably came out of a wolf way, 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 way back, but it doesn't look anything like that little wolf does it? I mean, at least look at my dog, it doesn't. My dog is a genetic mistake. Right? He's part cat almost. If I believed you could cross those over, I think he would have already done it. Okay? You just get the idea that obviously we understand genetics have changed, and people add to that as well. How do people usually marry? Just common, don't they normally marry within their own family kind? You understand what I'm talking about? Now Fred is different. Wayne and Carlotta are maybe a little different, but that's not common, is it? Is it? I remember hearing about the pygmies. There's pygmies in was it in Central America or South America in the jungles? These little short people, real short people, and they would actually marry based on height. That was one of the things they did, and so they kept that genetic problem, and they had feet problems and all sorts of stuff. But they actually honored some of that kind of stuff because of the fact that that's how they chose. We do that too. We do that too, and so that allows it to stay distinct a lot longer. But guess what would happen if we all started blending back together from back? For the most part, you'd have common, just a light brown skin that everybody would have if we were all mixing back together like that.
God would change our language.
God would have to change our language. Okay? So that's kind of what we're getting to see, all right? And there's some more to that. I'm just kind of giving you a very, very broad understanding of that. It's that the splitting of the nations have forced certain gene pools to stay in certain places. And then people begin to favor those certain looks as well, to see that way. Okay? All right. Well, let's ask some final questions and then we are done. Got 6 questions. See how well you do. Number 1, we looked at evidence such as the legends of a common language and ziggurat structures found around the globe, which seem to confirm the Genesis account of the people spreading across the globe. Why do many people, even those claiming to be Christians, reject this as an actual account of the origin of various people groups around the world? Maybe you haven't met any of those type of people, but why would people do that? Are they even? You talk about even people who claim to be Christians are trying to deny God? Let me say it this way. It's similar to why people would say they don't believe that the Genesis days are literal 24-hour days. Why are they trying to do that? Could be because they're denying God. I'd say an atheist would say that. Or somebody who says, I don't believe the Bible's true, might say something like that. But why would someone who claims to be a Christian say something like that? Maybe ignorance could be one. I'll grant it, possible. 2, it's probably, for the most part, because they've allowed what the culture says to influence the way they believe the Bible. And that's the wrong part. And Christians do that still today, don't they? They let the culture influence the way they view the Scriptures rather than the Scriptures affect the way they view the culture. Okay? Yeah, that's the way it's supposed to be. Yes, sir?
Is that what you call in Sunday school exegesis, bringing outside?
Yes, bringing outside in to interpret the Scripture. Yeah, trying to... What they'll end up saying are things like this, that it's actually those stories are just meant to be allegories that teach certain moral lessons and garbage like that. You know, it's hard to do that when you've got all these dates and times and histories that seem to be pretty definitive. And then you've got, and even if you want to say, well, they're just making a very complex story to make it sound neat, well, that's fine, but how come you got evidence outside of the Bible that seems to go along with that? I mean, you're having a hard time to sit there and try to balance that and go down that path. And really, I'd just rather be taking what God's Word seems to say pretty literally rather than ignoring it and saying it doesn't mean anything. So God wrote it for a reason, has a purpose for it. Number 2, were God's plans for the people to multiply and fill the earth thwarted by the disobedience of the people?
For a time.
For a time? Does His plan does He ever fail?
No.
Even accomplishing His will in man, does He fail? No, He still is in control. And He demonstrated that He's in control, didn't He? Because when stubborn man decided not to do what He said, I don't care, you're still going to do what I said. Right? It just took a little while. Yep. Number 3, what attributes of God did this judgment demonstrate? We talk about attributes. What characteristics? What are some qualities of God that we see showing up in this passage? Sovereignty. What about the ability to change things suddenly? Reprogram everybody's brain. What would you call that? Omnipotence. Probably omniscient as well, knowing everything. I mean, you would expect somebody who knows everything to be able to do something like that, but not somebody who doesn't know everything. Right? What else? That we heard sovereign, okay? That He's just, that He's always going to pursue what's right and stop what's wrong. We see that characteristic show up as well. Okay? Number 4. The people who were gathering together in Shinar were removed from the judgment of the flood by only a few generations. The details of the flood would have been directly available to them through Noah's testimony. Noah was alive during the lifetime of Terah, Abraham's father, and Abraham could have spoken directly to Shem. Does it surprise you that this rebellion happened so quickly? Explain. Why not? Because men are what? What did we learn what did God say to Noah after he got off the ark? Men are evil from their youth. They don't have to be taught it. They start off that way. They have it from their youth. Okay? Number 5. Knowing that this is the tendency of mankind, how do we conduct our lives so that we don't fall into this pattern? How do you keep yourself from becoming like them? Go to church, okay? Read your Bible. I heard someone say something back here. I didn't hear it. Was it you? Follow after Christ. Paul? Keep the Word. What does Jesus say we to do? Take up our cross daily and follow Him. It's that same attitude, right? It's the daily dying to yourself. Because even believers can be caught up into things they shouldn't be caught up into. And if they don't work at dying to self, guess what happens? The flesh takes over. And wrong living begins to be the pattern of their life. And following the way of the culture becomes to be the pattern of their life. And I'll just say this. Say, can believers get that way? Yeah, they can get that way, but they get miserable when they get that way. They're the most unpleasant people to be around. People that are not where they know they should be with God. So it doesn't mean that God has let go and somehow He doesn't have any control over their lives. He just chastens them in the midst of that. Then number 6. We see in Genesis 8:21 that God knew that man's heart would continue to be evil from his youth. The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. That's the quote. Yet He simply confused their language rather than wiping them out again. How is this a picture of God's continuing mercy and grace to mankind today, including you? Still here? Let me ask you, how many people, raise your hand, how many people think you deserve to live today? Raise your hand. Nobody in here should be raising their hand, Frederick. Nobody deserves to live. Why? Because the soul that sins, it shall die. That's God's word. What should be happening to us daily? Being destroyed by God. But what does He hold back daily? He holds back His wrath and gives us grace and mercy all the time. Yes, sir.
I think we should live at least 400 years.
So we can get more and more evil, huh?
Yeah, I got a lot of farming left.
Got a lot of farming left to do. Of course, Bill. Always going to have farming. All right. Maybe God will give you a few more years to plant some more corn. He's been very good to you. Yes, you're right. Yeah, I got some good rain. I don't know if it was enough for what you wanted, but you got some.
Enough for now.
Enough for now. Good. God's goodness to us. All right. Well, let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer, and we'll come back. We're going to look at part 3 of salvation, part 3. We talked about, and I'm not going to get into it ahead of time, but we're going to look at one more little element, and then we're going to change the subjects next week. Something else that I think you'll enjoy as well. Okay. Brother Fred, can you close us in prayer for this part?